history of African people, people of African ancestry, so-called Negroes, so-called colored people, has intentionally been distorted, hence his 1933 publication, The Miseducation of the Negro. So there was an intentional effort over the past 100 plus years to erase our memory after we had been stolen from the land of our ancestors and told that we were Negroes, told that we were colored, told that we were everything but a child of God.
As Africans and black people around the world, we are not about to discard our history. We are even now trying to learn more about ourselves that was hidden from us to become inferior. I've come across a video from Dr. Anthony Browder, who is a historian, author, and a publisher. He has dived deep into black history. I want us to watch this video. I will be back.
If we understand that the history of African people is a history that has been distorted, it's a history that has been perverted, and to a large extent, it's a history that's been erased. So my job is to go back and recover the fractured pieces of our history, and then to share it with my audiences in such a way that it wakens them from the sleep, the deep sleep that we've been in, that we've been socialized to be in and accept as our normal state. History of African people, people of African ancestry, so-called Negroes, so-called colored people, has intentionally been distorted, hence his 1933 publication, The Miseducation of the Negro. So there was an intentional effort over the past 100 plus years to erase our memory after we had been stolen from the land of our ancestors and told that we were Negroes, told that we were colored, told that we were everything but a child of God. And so part of Dr. Woodson's efforts and those also of Dr. John Henry Clark, is the 100th anniversary of his birth this year. So these are two men who I highly respect, who understood the importance of helping us restore our memory.
Who was the original man?
There's no question about the fact that the first human being, the first Homo sapiens sapiens, developed only in Africa, only in East Africa. You know, as a matter of fact, there is a new exhibit, a $20 million exhibit at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. This exhibit was funded by David Koch of the Koch brothers. It is an exhibit that is also being supported by the United States Congress, and it's in the David Koch Hall of Human Origins. In this exhibit, they acknowledge the fact that humanity only began in Africa, and that human beings, Homo sapiens sapiens, are 200,000 years old. But another important aspect in this exhibit is that they state a historical truth that these Africans began migrating out of Africa into Asia around 60,000 years ago, and it was only about 40,000 years ago that groups of these same Africans began migrating to Western Asia, to the continent that we now call Europe. So in that regard, we can say beyond a shadow of a doubt that the first Europeans were African.
So the most racist redneck in North Carolina today.
Or Washington, D.C.
Or Washington, D.C. If it follows that the original man was a black man.
Right. The original man was African specifically, because we know that based on the archaeological evidence, but we also know that fact based on the mitochondrial DNA. Back in 1987, a group of geneticists studied the oldest mitochondrial DNA. Now, mitochondrial DNA is that part of your cell structure that is passed on to you by your mother. So we all are familiar with the statement, mama's baby, daddy's maybe. Everybody knows who the mama is. Daddy may be a question mark, but everyone knows who the mama is. And so by studying the mitochondrial DNA of a cross-section of so-called races and nationalities all around the world, these geneticists concluded that every person on this planet carries a mitochondrial DNA that has been traced to a group of women who are still living in Africa. Thus, there is no such thing as race. Race was a false construct created by racists in order to divide people based on color. So there is only one race, the human race, which had its origins in Africa. Thus, by extension, every person on this planet is of African ancestry.
Where was Jesus born?
That's a good question. Where was Jesus born and when was Jesus born is another question. If we accept the basic story, he was born in what was Northeast Africa before the Suez Canal was built. So he would have been a person of color, not the blonde-haired, blue-eyed individual that we see in many churches. His story is a story of the struggle of people of color against oppressive invaders. It's a story that resonates with most people of African ancestry.
Most people of African ancestry, African Americans in this country, by and large, are known to be the most religious people in the country.
Probably in the world, brother.
African Americans,
Yeah.
yeah, man. Sunday is a very, very big day where the overwhelming majority of African Americans worship in houses of Christian belief.
Right. So if we remember what Dr. King said, 11 o'clock on Sunday is the most segregated hour in America.
Yes.
Black folk go to a black church and worship a white Jesus. White folk go to a white church and worship a white Jesus. But the issue is, if we understand the geographical reality of the place where Jesus was born, there were no white people there at the time. That's another issue.
I don't want to be at all trite with religion.
Sure.
I don't play with people's religion. But Scripture talks about Jesus being an individual who had hands and feet the color of not just brass, but burned brass.
Right.
That's dark.
Right.
And hair like lamb's wool.
Right.
That's not blonde and blue-eyed. When did Jesus and how did Jesus as a symbol become blonde and blue-eyed?
Well, most people that I know who are Christians and lovers of the Bible, lovers of Jesus, know nothing about a man by the name of Eusebius. Eusebius was the man who in 325 was Constantine's Karl Rove. He organized the Nicene Council and literally determined what books were going to go into the Bible.
Let me just say something for a viewer who might not have heard or understood what you just said.
Yes.
Said it was Constantine's Karl Rove.
Yes, indeed.
Karl Rove is the quintessential dirty tricks guy.
Yes, indeed.
For the Bush administration and the sort of the hard-wing conservative Republicans.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So, what we understand very clearly is that every people have a right to interpret their relationship to the Creator as seen through their own cultural lens. But what Constantine did was to use this newly created religion, Christianity, as a means to not only control people physically, but also to control their minds. And it was Eusebius who called together, I believe, 88 bishops who met in Nicaea in Turkey, and they literally determined the shape and tenor of the Bible. So this book was constructed by a group of men for political and social reasons, and it was around that time, around 25 years later, that they actually determined when Jesus was born. Now this is important because prior to 340 AD, no one knew when Jesus was born.
So let me challenge you.
Yes, sir.
As those out there might want to do. The Bible is the inerrant, infallible Word of God, and how dare you challenge that?
Well, I only talk about what I know, and I know that the Bible was a book that is comprised of 66 different chapters that were written by 66 different men over a period of 2,000 years. That's a fact. And if we deal with the facts, and the facts are not meant to take away anyone's belief, but I'm just stating facts. I'm just stating what I know. And so anyone who has studied the Bible, anyone who has conversations with theologians, knows these facts. And so there's a difference between belief and knowledge. Belief is something you accept without proof. But knowledge, whether it's religion or science or law, is based on facts. And I'm a person who is very guarded about my soul and who I trust my soul to. And I, as a thinking person, would never allow a thief, an enslaver, a raper, a murderer to describe for me my religious and spiritual boundaries.
Are you referring to someone in particular?
No, I'm referring to a culture. When we think in terms of people of African ancestry who have been stolen by the tens of millions and enslaved all over the world, what most people don't know, that it was Pope Eugenius IV who authorized the first papal bull giving the Portuguese the right to enslave African people. Now, it says in the Bible in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not steal and thou shalt not kill. So if Europeans just followed those two commandments, we would be having this conversation in Africa sitting under a mango tree. But the mere fact that the Pope said that Africans, or Negroes as the Portuguese called us, were not human beings, that we did not possess a soul, that then made it possible for every European nation, with the exception of Russia, to go in and steal tens of millions of African men, women, and children in the name of the Lord. So these are issues that are real, that are rarely discussed, but they need to be discussed if we're truly going to understand how we got where we are and truly develop a meaningful relationship with the Creator.
I think it is accurate to say that the version of the Bible today, and now for many decades, that is the one that is most often referred to, is the one that was written, commissioned by King James. The reason why I asked you earlier, were you talking about someone in particular, because you talked about a murderer and a rapist and a whole bunch of other characteristics that weren't so flattering.
Yes.
I thought you might have mentioned King James then. Tell us about King James, the writer, the commissioner, the author of the book that so many Christians today read.
Well, King James was a king, a ruler, who felt that he should not allow a ruler from another country, i.e. the Pope, to dictate how he was going to govern his people. So he decided.
So again, for history's sake, King James ruled England.
Yes,
and,
ruled England.
And the Pope was out of Rome.
Was out of Rome, exactly. And there was a split between the Anglo-Saxons in the UK and Rome and the Vatican, because they understood very clearly that this is a game, that people have been using their relationship with God in order to manipulate other people, to wage war, and to do some ungodly things. You know, it can truly be said that right now there are more people on earth being killed in the name of God than are being saved by God, whether they worship a Islamic God or a Jewish God or a Christian God. So some terrible things have been done in the name of God. And the history of humanity is replete with the names of people who have engaged in these actions. But King James was a man who, I once heard Dick Gregory refer to him as a man who would make Adolf Hitler look like Santa Claus. He was a murderer, and he wanted to have a book, his own version of the Bible, that would allow him to engage his subjects in the manner that he wanted to and still be looked upon favorably by God. And so he commissioned a team of writers to write the authorized version of the Bible. As a matter of fact, when the King James Version of the Bible was written, only members of the royal class were allowed to read the Bible. Anyone who was a poor person, a middle class or poor person, back in that day in England would be killed, would be in prison for reading the Bible. So this was a text that was exclusively written for a small subset of the British population at that time.
We're going to talk about Judaism and Islam. Right now, I want to stay with Christianity and the Holy Trinity. So many centuries ago, thousands of years ago, Isis, Horus, and Osiris were thought of as a Holy Trinity. By whom?
By the Greeks. The names Isis, Horus, and Osiris are Greek names. They're Greek names for African personalities. Now, we mentioned at the top of the show that I refer to myself as a memory recovery specialist. So let me just play that role for a second.
Please do.
We're here in Washington, D.C., and the most obvious symbol of the capital of the wealthiest and most powerful nation in human history is an object that is known as the Washington Monument.
Yes.
It stands in the geographical center of what was originally the 10-mile square of the capital of the United States of America. Now that symbol is an ancient African symbol which represents the resurrection of an African king named Asar, whose name was later changed by the Greeks to Osiris. So that symbol is the oldest symbol of resurrection known to man. And I might add, Rock, that symbol was developed in Africa, principally in Kemet, the country that the Greeks renamed Egypt. That symbol is over 6,000 years old. And it represents a man, Asar, who was the founding father of Kemet, the nation of the black people. And Asar was murdered by his brother. His body was cut into a variety of pieces. One story says 14 pieces, and scattered throughout the land. Asar's wife, Aset, who's known as Isis to the Greeks, searched throughout the Nile River and found 13 of the 14 parts of Asar's body. She laid each of the pieces out and literally remembered her husband, washed his body with oils, wrapped his body in bandages, and created the first mummy in human history. And as she was about to bury her husband, she grieved, as any wife would grieve, because she was about to bury the man that she loved. She also grieved because, according to a story that is over 6,000 years old, a story with plenty of documentation that I see every year when I travel to Egypt, Aset was also a virgin. And before she buried her husband, the spirit of her deceased husband, Asar, came and impregnated her. And then 9 months later, the virgin Aset gave birth to this son, Heru. Now, according to some versions of the story, Heru was born 6,000 years ago on December the 25th. So we have, within the story of the founding Paris of ancient Kemet, Asar, Set, and Heru, the fundamental story that would later be incorporated into the Bible as the story of Jesus. And there are numerous parallels that, again, any person who is questioning what I'm saying, if they were to have a conversation with any trained priest or rabbi or bishop, someone who is going to divinity school, they know this story. And that is also the reason why you'll find this same symbol that looks like the Washington Monument. It was known originally as a tekken. We know it better by its Greek name, obelisk. They will find a tekken in the center of St. Peter's Square. So you have to ask the question, what is this African symbol of resurrection doing in the center of the Vatican? And why is it that every Easter Sunday, when the Pope stands on his balcony and delivers his sermon about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, there are 150,000 people standing in St. Peter's Square surrounding that tekken, that oldest symbol of resurrection, and every Pope knows that story. So it begs the issue that not only do people of African ancestry need to have their memories restored, but people of all nations need to know the greater truth of an African story that has been hidden from most people on this planet.
In 1993, I think it was, I was at the Vatican, and they took us on a tour. And I asked the tour guide, could he allow me to see the Black Madonna? I thought he was going to have a heart attack. Tell us about the Black Madonna.
Well, the Black Madonna, there are several Black Madonnas. Pope John Paul II is from Poland, Czeskokowa, and in Czeskokowa, they have a shrine of the Black Madonna. So every time the Pope went home, he would go and pray at the feet of the Black Madonna. The Black Madonna is the Greek version of Isis and Horus, which is the Europeanized version of Heru and Aset. So this story that I told earlier about Asar, Aset, and Heru, and the virgin Aset being impregnated by the spirit of her husband Asar, and Aset giving birth to Heru on December the 25th. So if we follow that narrative, Aset was forced to flee for her life because the king of Kemet, Egypt at that time, Set, was looking to kill the son. And so Aset and her son literally hid in the bulrushes. And I could take you to temples in Egypt and show you these images. And so she was, Aset and Heru were worshipped by the Greeks as the Black Madonna and Child. And then it was later, much later, that Eusebius took these ancient stories, took these ancient myths, and that's the essence of it. This story is mythology. It is not a historical fact, but it is a myth that is used to imbue people with a certain level of understanding so that they can relate to things beyond the physical. And so it was Eusebius who grafted these stories into the new narrative that they were creating in order to control the people physically, mentally, and spiritually.
You use the term myth.
Yes, sir.
Would you then suggest that the birth of Christ in the manger and the Holy Trinity is a myth also?
Rock, you're going to get me in trouble.
Okay. That's what we do.
But let me say this. I remember in 19 1981, reading John Jackson's book, The Introduction to African Civilization. And John Jackson was a brilliant human being. He probably had a photographic memory, a brilliant scholar. And in his book, Introduction to African Civilization, he talks about the Christ myth. Now, there's a book called 101 Myths of the Bible. There's a book by Kersey Graves called 16 Crucified Saviors. And in this book, we find that there are 16 historical personalities that grew out of myths about 16 personalities who also were the product of a virgin birth, who also were born on December the 25th, who also were symbolically crucified. So what you see in this narrative is that myths are powerful tools that may not necessarily be true, but they have truth in them. And so it's a means of telling a historical narrative across time and space, such that everybody can relate to it. So in that context, if you like, I could break down the mythological elements of the story of the birth of Jesus the Christ. And it's all based on historical facts and astronomical facts.
I'll tell you something. As the foundation of Christianity,
yes,
I'd like for you to take a stab at your thoughts on just that.
Well,
Do that breakdown.
And let me put this in context, because I was born and raised in Chicago. I grew up in a Christian household. My grandmother was probably the most religious person I ever met in my life. She took me to church, and every time I went to church, I would ask questions. Yeah. Why don't I see people who look like me in the Bible? Why, and I asked, and she would say, just don't ask questions.
Yeah, like my mom did.
And so that developed in me an inquisitive mind, and led to me asking questions that I wasn't supposed to know the answers to. And when I, as a college student here at Howard, would go home and have conversations with my grandmother about some of the things that I was learning, I realized that my grandmother was not prepared for the information, to receive the information that I learned. But because I loved my grandmother, I respected her and didn't try to move her beyond where she was. Because she needed Christianity. She needed her belief in Jesus Christ in order to help her deal with life in Chicago in the 1960s. But what I know, based on studying history and science, is that the story of virgin births in many cultures is based on mythology. We're told that Jesus was born in a manger. We're told that 3 wise men came to visit him. They followed the star that was in the east. Now, this is based on astronomical phenomena, because around the time of December the 21st, we have the solstice, with the winter solstice, which is the shortest day of the year. And from December the 21st through December the 24th, literally the sun is still. The length of the day does not increase nor decrease significantly. So the sun is still. On December the 25th, that is when it was written in ancient texts that the sun, the S-U-N, was born, because the day began to lengthen by approximately 1 minute per day. So at the time that the sun was born on December the 25th, that the constellation of Virgo was rising on the horizon, was halfway above the horizon. So it was said symbolically, metaphorically, that the sun, S-U-N, was born of a virgin. And at the same time, the stable of Aegeus was rising in the east. So it was said that the sun was born in a stable, and that there were 3 stars that are the 3 stars in the belt of Orion that point to the star Sirius. Those 3 stars were known in ancient times as the 3 wise men. So if we look at the story of the birth of Jesus the Christ, it is a story of cultural significance, mythological significance, and astronomical significance that means 3 different things to people who have an awareness of this story and know how to interpret it.
Again, staying with Christianity still. Christians are governed by their code of conduct on this earthly plane, governed by the 10 Commandments.
Yes.
That the Word of God, or did that come from something called the Book of the Dead?
Well, I recall James Henry Breasted, who was a famous American Egyptologist at the University of Chicago, established the Oriental Institute in, I think, around 1935. James Henry Breasted got in trouble for saying that the 10 Commandments were derived from the 42 admonitions of Ma'at. What does that mean? Ma'at in ancient Kemet was the overriding force that governed everything in the universe. She represented the principles of justice, balance, harmony, and that there were 42 admonitions of Ma'at. Some of them were, I have not stolen, I have not robbed, I have not defrauded offerings, I have not polluted myself, I have not polluted the land, I have not committed adultery, I have not spoken ill against God. And so it is from the 42 admonitions of Ma'at that Moses derived the 10 Commandments. And so there is a profound difference between an admonition of Ma'at, where one declares your innocence and says, I have not done X, Y, and Z, and a commandment where people without a profound understanding of Ma'at must be commanded not to do things that a person in their right mind would know not to do. So these are cultural differences that are based upon another culture appropriating aspects of African culture and interpreting it through their own cultural lens.
Talk to us, you just mentioned Moses.
Yes.
So to help us understand that you're talking about sort of the beginning of time and the beginning of man, going back into ancient Egypt, which was originally Kemet. From whence comes the three religions? Tell us about the development of those three religions.
All right. Well, as I mentioned earlier, Africa is the birthplace of humanity.
Yes.
No question about that. And it's also in Africa where we have the birthplace of culture and civilization. And an important civilizing aspects of all culture is how people relate to the unseen presence of the forces of creation, which we today refer to as God. So we will find in ancient Kemet the very earliest examples of people identifying with this unseen force, which we today call God. Now, the ancient Egyptians did not have a religion per se. There was no word in their culture for religion, but they had a spiritual tradition. The ancient Egyptians, or Kemites, were responsible for giving us the word amen, a word that Jews use, Christians use, and Muslims use. It is a word in the Kemetic language which means the unseen presence of the Creator. The unseen presence of the Creator. And so we have within this structure a people who understood that there is an invisible force that we can't see that affects everything on life. And through a process of identifying what they refer to as netures. Netur is a term that means the principle or aspects of the Creator. The mind of man is too weak, too small to understand the totality of the Creator. But by understanding the many fragments or parts of the visible manifestations of the Creator in the air, in the water, in the plants, we can come to know this force. And by knowing this force and incorporating this knowledge into our lives, we can cultivate a relationship where we lift ourselves up. So we have in Kemet the very first people who talked about a relationship with the unseen God. We have in Kemet the first temples that were built to acknowledge or to house the Spirit of God, and a process, rituals, if you will, for strengthening that relationship. And so the people of Kemet established the oldest culture known to man. It was in their day what the United States is today, the most powerful nation on the planet. So people came to Kemet from all over the world. People came without a religion, studied the spiritual traditions in Kemet, and then left with a concept which they then introduced to their people, which became known to them as religion. But if you look at the origins of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, you will see beyond a shadow of a doubt that they are rooted in ancient African spiritual traditions.
I want to talk about the pyramids after I have you to weigh in on this. I read a quote recently where Hippocrates gave great reverence and credibility. Today, doctors say the Hippocratic Oath. That's referring to Hippocrates, who was often thought and taught as the original doctor.
Right.
He gave credence and honored in his quotes Imhotep.
Right.
Who was Imhotep? And
well, in
we probably don't have enough time for you to really.
I do the light version.
Please do.
In the Hippocratic Oath, Hippocrates says, I swear by the god Apollo and Asclepius, the god of medicine. Asclepius is the Greek name for Imhotep. Imhotep is regarded as the world's first multi-genius. Imhotep was the prime minister to the king Zoser, the man who, Imhotep was the person who designed and oversaw the construction of the first pyramid on the planet, the step pyramid at Saqqara for Zoser. Imhotep was the first physician in recorded history. Imhotep was also an architect and engineer.
Before you go beyond him being a physician.
Yes, sir.
A physician who had written out certain formulas of medicine that continue to be viable today.
Yes, sir. The first physicians, the first gynecologists, the first brain surgeons came out of Kemet. The first test by a physician to determine if a woman was pregnant was developed in Kemet. The first test to determine the sex of a baby was born in Kemet. So if you had all of this knowledge happening in Africa back at least, I would say at least 1000 BC, then it would make sense that others would come here to learn this science and then go home and then declare themselves to be the originator of medicine or the originator of philosophy, which is essentially what the Greeks did. But in their early writings, they acknowledged the fact that this source of information came out of the Nile Valley, came out of Egypt.
I've got people in my family who hit me across my head and say that everything about that you're talking about in ancient Egypt was paganism.
Well, all pagan means is someone whose belief is other than your own. So in that context, to a Christian, a Muslim is pagan. You know, to a Jew, a Christian is pagan. And if we think about this in that larger context, you know, the Jewish people were responsible for giving us the Torah, first 5 books of Moses, the Old Testament, and then the New Testament was built on that foundation. Well, no one really questions the fact that within the Jewish faith, they don't acknowledge Jesus as a Messiah. But no one questions them on that or challenges them on that because they are the chosen people. But what most people don't really understand is that the knowledge that is inherent within, much of the knowledge that is inherent within the Jewish tradition comes straight out of the Nile Valley. Sigmund Freud knew that. In the book that was published shortly after his death, Moses and Monotheism, Sigmund Freud said that the origins of Judaism are Egyptian, that Moses was an Egyptian, and there are many other scholars who have advanced this work, and it's talked about in small quarters of the world, but it's information that hasn't made its way to the general public.
Something happened to me. It saddened me and humored me at the same time. I was in New York, and I got in the cab, was running out to JFK from Midtown, and I thought I could tell by the cab driver's name that he was Egyptian. So I said, where are you from? You know? So he said, I'm from Egypt. I said, hey, my African brother. And he almost lost his mind. I am not African. Is he African?
Well, the last time I checked, Egypt is still on the continent of Africa. So that would mean indirectly that he wasn't African, even though we know that the Arabs did not come into Egypt as invaders until 648 AD. So they are interlopers. I know, and I have this conversation with many Egyptians. I travel to Egypt every year, have done that for the last 34 years, and made many friends with many Egyptians and taught them their history. Most Egyptians believe that their ancestors built the pyramids. When I show them a historical timeline and show them that what we call the pyramids, because the pyramid is a Greek word as well, what we call the pyramids were built by Africans over 1,000 years before Muhammad was even thought of.
So you say Imhotep?
Yes, Imhotep designed and oversaw the construction of the first pyramid, a 190 foot-high building, a 19-story skyscraper that is still standing in Africa today.
Still standing, and has anyone figured out how it was done yet?
We're not clear. We're not sure. Now we can begin to figure out how that structure was built, but it's the 3 main pyramids at Giza Plateau that has kept the world wondering. The Great Pyramid at Giza is the first and the oldest wonder of the 7 wonders of the world, and the only one that's still remaining. And that has remained a mystery because it was built with a technology that modern man still does not know how to use or to replicate.
And if you would, let's explore for a second some of the fundamentals of that. There were stone blocks weighing 20 tons.
There are 5 stone blocks above what's known as the King's Chamber that weigh around 20 tons, more than a railroad locomotive. But the majority of the blocks, which comprise the main pyramid of Khufu, weigh on average about 2.5 tons. So you're talking about over 3 million stone blocks, which weigh an average of 2.5 tons each, that were built to a height of 480 feet, that are 2.5 blocks wide by 2.5 blocks wide by 2.5 blocks wide by 2.5 blocks wide. The structure contains enough stone blocks to make approximately 30 Empire State Buildings. So we can say beyond a shadow of a doubt that they were not built by slave labor, and definitely were not built by Jews, because Abraham, the first Jew, was not even born at the time that these buildings were constructed. We know the name of the architect who designed it, and we also know where the builders, the engineers who helped constructed this structure are buried right nearby. So we know that this was one of the greatest feats of human engineering ever accomplished on this planet, and it's in Africa, which is one of the reasons why people want to disassociate Egypt from Africa, because it means that Africans must have developed this technology thousands of years ago.
And so, to your understanding and extensive research, what do you think is the most plausible explanation given by experts as to how it was done?
They don't know.
It's just, or is it just flat, straight mystery?
They don't know. Now, no, we're talking primarily about the main, 3 main pyramids at Giza.
Yeah.
They have no idea. The Japanese in the 1970s tried to build a pyramid using the technology that they thought was available at the time, using copper tools and manual labor. And they damaged more stones within a period of 3 months than they had stones to work with. They tried having men haul the stones, and they got stuck in the sand. They started using helicopters and 20th century technology, and they couldn't build a pyramid. So it remains a mystery. But let me just share with you and your listeners, Rock, an important aspect of this structure. The word pyramid is a Greek word, which means little flat cake, like a pancake. That name was used to describe the approximately 100 pyramids around Saqqara that had collapsed. Very, very small buildings that collapsed, and maybe to the Greeks looked like pancakes. But the original name, the African name for this structure, is Mir. And the word Mir means the place of ascension. Now, the Mir, or pyramids, were never tombs. There were no bodies ever buried in any of them. The bodies were always buried underneath them. So if we follow this logic, if Mir is a structure that means the place of ascension, then these structures were built over tombs, primarily to facilitate the ascension of the souls buried beneath them into heaven, where they will be reborn. So this grew out of the ancient African concept of spirituality. The ancient Africans and Kemet were the first human beings who wrote about the soul, who wrote about the salvation of the soul, and specifically talked about where the soul of human beings go after they die to be reborn. All of that is documented in a text that is known mistakenly as the pyramid text, found in the pyramid, in the tomb underneath the pyramid of Unas, who was the last king of the 5th dynasty. We have a copy of the pyramid text in the tomb that we're currently excavating, the 25th dynasty tomb that we're currently excavating. So we're able to show, document beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Africans were the first people to have a concept of the soul, the immortality of the soul. And then in our 25th dynasty tomb, 2,000 years later, we have a record of Africans having retained that knowledge and recording it on the walls of the tomb of a priest named Karak Amen. Karak Amen. He was a chief priest.
Not Rock Newman, Karak Amen.
He may have been one of your descendants, brother. but this priest, 2,700 years ago, was responsible for saying the morning libations at the Holy of Holies of Apet-Aset, or Karnak Temple, the largest temple complex in the world, where he alone knew the words to call, to evoke the unseen presence of Amen, the unseen presence of God Almighty, and invite his spirit to come and inhabit the Holy of Holies, which they call the ancestors' room. So the idea was that this priest, Karak Amen, would call down the presence of God Almighty into a sacred space, and his spirit will literally inspire the 83,000 people who worked in this temple complex. This is a profound history, a profound story, which we need to know.
You know, before I rush towards the end of the show here, you gave us some rather interesting slides.
Yes.
And I'd like to kind of go down the list here and
Sure.
have you, we're going to be able to put them up on the screen if I'm correct here. And I'm going to just go sort of in sequential order. The first one you gave us, number one, is Nile Valley cover art.
Right.
If you can
that's the cover
quickly-
to my second book, Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization. And much of what we talked about in this show is in that book. And so what we show is a continuity between ancient African culture and civilization and its influences on contemporary culture and civilization.
And number two is Kemet versus Egypt. Kemet versus Egypt.
Kemet versus Egypt. Now, this is key because in December, there was controversy over this new film called Exodus of Gods and Kings. And the controversy centered around whether or not the Egyptians were black or white.
Rupert Murdoch said all the Egyptians I know are white.
Right, and he's probably right. All the Egyptians he knows are white, but he doesn't know the Kemites. So there is a profound difference, and what you'll see in that image on the screen is that there's a profound difference between Kemet and Egypt. Egypt is a Greek word that was used to describe one temple in Kemet, and so Kemet was ruled by indigenous African people by almost 3,000 years. Egypt was ruled by Greeks for approximately 600 years. So if you look at that image on the screen, you can see 9 African rulers of Kemet and 3 European rulers of Egypt. So Egypt is white, but Kemet is African.
Abu Simbel, number 3.
Abu Simbel was a profound temple built for King Ramses II. And even in that movie, Exodus of Gods and Kings, they distorted history, which is one of the reasons why the movie was banned in Egypt. They distorted the history of ancient Egypt, where you saw Seti I, the father of Ramses, died, and they buried him in Abu Simbel. Well, you know, the temple of Abu Simbel was not built until at least 40 years after Seti I died. So they took liberties with the truth. But it is that temple carved out of a mountain, which to me embodies the spiritual, architectural, and technological excellence in the Nile Valley. And if you look at those 4-seated statues of the King Ramses II, they look very much like the statue of Abraham Lincoln sitting in the Lincoln Memorial. As a matter of fact, the sculptor of the Lincoln Memorial, Daniel Chester French, was inspired by Abu Simbel, and he wanted to recreate that here in Washington, D.C.
You talk about the Lincoln Memorial. Obviously, that's right here in the nation's
Right here in
capital,
D.C.
in Washington, D.C. The fourth slide here is Egypt on the Potomac.
Egypt on the Potomac is a field trip that I created back in 1986, where I show, it's a 3-hour activity where we take people around the city and show them the essence of ancient Kemetic architecture, science, and philosophy laid out in D.C. So the monument is one example. The monument and the reflection pool is another example. The same thing existed in Kemet thousands of years earlier. So it's an activity where we show people the truth that I'm sharing with you today. And they can also take that field trip anytime between April and November.
You mentioned Washington Monument in the reflecting pool.
Yes.
Tell us more about that.
All right. So we see millions of tourists come to D.C. every year, and they marvel at the architecture in D.C., never realizing that much of it was inspired by African architecture. The Washington Monument is one example with this beautiful reflection in the reflection pool. Every year I take groups to Egypt and show them that same imagery. When we go to the temple of Ipet-Aset, Karnak Temple, where my guy, Karakamoon, worked, you can see a pair of Teknu or obelisks, and you can see their reflection in their reflection pool. Every temple in Kemet had obelisks or Teknu and a reflection pool. So this indirectly pays homage to the legacy of our African ancestors.
The Washington Monument sits 555 feet
Yes.
straight up.
Yes, sir.
It sits at what seems to be a center point between the Capitol and the Lincoln Memorial in one direction, and the Jefferson Memorial and the White House in another direction,
Yes.
and it seems to make a cross.
Right, and in my book, Egypt on the Potomac, I laid that out. The mall is shaped like a cross. The monument was to sit in the geographical center of the 10-mile square, which was to be the capital of the United States of America. So just think about this for a second. If America's founding fathers had an opportunity to establish a new nation. They developed the first planned capital in the modern era, and they determined that that capital was to be a specific shape. Now, you mentioned the monument is 555 feet high. It's also 55 feet wide at the base, and there's a specific reason why that number 5 is repeated 5 times. We have the city in the shape of a square. There's a specific reason for that. And then we have in the center of the square this African symbol of resurrection. These are not accidents. They're not coincidence. And so in my book now, Valley Contributions to Civilization in Egypt on the Potomac, I begin to lay out this information, which really should be taught in every school throughout the country, and not just during Black History Month, because this is world history.
This is beyond fascinating. How can my viewers, and I want to take our time with this.
Yes, sir.
How can our viewers become a part of your Egypt on the Potomac class tour?
Sure. Well, they can go to our website, which is ikg-info.com.
Say it again.
ikg-info.com. And on our website, you'll see information about the Egypt on the Potomac field trip, our study tours to Egypt, our excavations that we're currently doing now in Egypt, and other activities that we have at our cultural center at 1816 12th Street, Northwest Washington.
And they go on that tour with you and nobody's going to burn in hell?
Well, first of all, it's not a tour, it's a field trip. We make a distinction between a tour and a field trip because Black folk cannot afford to come to D.C. as tourists. Our history is all up in this place, brother. And once you know it, once you see it, once you recognize it in Meridian Hill Park, elsewhere, it imbues you with a sense of pride and helps you begin to see the world totally differently.
My niece wants to know that she's not going to go to hell if she does that.
No, she won't.
Okay, all right. Let's go down to slide number 11, Lincoln versus Ramses.
All right, well, as I mentioned earlier, the statue of Lincoln in the memorial is modeled after the statue of Ramses II at Abu Simbel, created by Daniel Chester French, who was inspired by the monuments that he saw in Egypt. That's clear, crystal clear.
Let's go to number 14. How do you pronounce that?
Karakamen.
Karakamen. Yes.
We are excavating the 25th dynasty tomb of this priest, Karakamen. It's a 2,700-year-old tomb. We are, through the ASA Restoration Project, the first African Americans in history to fund and participate in the excavation of a tomb. And it is at that site, we've been there since 2008, working in conjunction with my colleague, Dr. Alina Pistakova, who discovered the tombs in 2006. We're funding this project because other people are not interested in uncovering the 25th dynasty, which is the only period, unfortunately, in Egyptian history that Egyptologists will give to African people, because Kemet at that time was ruled by people from Kush. And I might add, since we talked earlier about Christianity in the Bible, Karakamun's uncle, Shabaka was his father. Karakamun's uncle, Taharka, is the only African king, only African pharaoh mentioned by name in the Bible. And the reason that is because Taharka, when he was the ruler of Kemet and Kush, ruled at that time the largest empire in the world, and he protected Jerusalem from the Assyrians. So that's why in the Jewish text, they acknowledge this African king who saved their nation.
Number 18, the slide, father and daughter in burial chamber.
You know, one of the greatest joys of any father is to know that their child is following in their footsteps. And I've had the honor of taking my daughter to Egypt with me since she was 7 years old. She'll be 33 this year. For the last 6 years, my daughter has been traveling to Egypt with me every summer, participating in this excavation. And in 2010, we found the burial chamber of this priest, Karakamun. It was 70 feet underground. My daughter, I'm very proud to say, was the first African-American in history to go inside of that tomb, and I was right behind her. And you can see in that image that we're in this very crowded space that was filled with debris. It had already been robbed, but there's this wonderful image on the ceiling of this Egyptian sky goddess by the name of Nut. There's a profound imagery on the ceiling that speaks to a profound understanding of astronomy. And you also find in the ceiling of Karakamun's temple tomb the imagery that states where the souls of people go to be reborn and resurrected. It's all in that tomb.
You will have a lot of people that will say, look, let's focus on the here and now.
Yes.
Why is history important?
History, as Dr. John Henry Clark often said, history is the clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. So if that's real, then what time is it for black folk? Black folk are in worse shape today than we were 50 years ago because we don't know our story. We have allowed others to tell us who we are. Dr. Clark also said that history is the compass where people find themselves on the map of human geography. History tells you who you were and where you were. History tells you who you are and where you are. But the most important role of history is to tell the people where they still must go and who they still must become. So my responsibility as a memory recovery specialist is to wake up those people who've been taught to believe that they were Negroes, that they were colored people, that they're black, and to begin to help them understand that you're African. You're descendants of the first people. You're descendants of the first people who created the first culture, and there's much that we can pass on to our children so that they would not see themselves as thugs, as dogs, as B's and H's, but see themselves as having made significant contributions, that they have the capacity, the right now, to reincorporate into their life. They should know more about Imhotep than they know about Jay-Z and Beyonce.
What has been the reaction of mainstream academia to much of what you're doing? I asked that question, and here's the backdrop. My wife also traveled to Egypt, and from the time she was 12 years old, she's been fascinated with Africa and Egyptian history. And she did some stuff when she was getting her master's from American University. She stayed 7 weeks in Luxor. And it was an eye-opening experience for her. Part of what she became aware of was the intense effort for the truth not to be told.
Well, unfortunately, that is true. There are lies that are being perpetuated and truths that are being covered up, which is why I have devoted 34 years of my life documenting truths and sharing it with people who have been conditioned to have an adverse reaction to the truth. I mean, Adolf Hitler said that you can tell a lie with such skill that people will reject the truth when it's presented to them. I know that to be a fact, but I also know that there are people who hear the information that I'm sharing with you and your listeners, and it clicks with them. People in this society, Rock, are looking for answers because they have seen that many of our institutions, in fact, many times our government, and sometimes even our churches have failed us. They have not been the institutions that taught the truth that they were supposed to. So people are searching for truth, and what I'm suggesting to people is that consider other sources of knowledge. Learn to read. Turn off the television, except for the Rock Newman show.
Yeah.
And read a book. Share reading with your children. You know, I heard George Frazier shared with an audience recently that 67% of African American college graduates never read another book after graduating from college. Right. And that African Americans watch 73 hours of television every single week. So there's a direct correlation between watching television and a diminishment in one's cultural competency and intelligence. So you find in the United States, for example, the culture that watches the least amount of television, the Asian culture, do the best academically. So there's a direct correlation in a society which intentionally dumbs you down. So I'm so grateful to be on a show that is intelligent, a show that brings on guests who may not necessarily get exposure on other television programs, where we're provided with an opportunity to begin to speak some truth to an audience and maybe encourage them to begin to read and expand that truth themselves.
You've been going to Egypt for 34 years and taking people with you.
Yes, sir.
You're going in 2015?
Yes, sir. I go every year.
When and how can folks join you?
Again, people can go to my website. We have information on our study tours to Egypt as well. We're doing a trip to Ethiopia. And brother, everything that I've said about Egypt in our conversation today, I can multiply by 10 regarding Ethiopia. Ethiopia is the mother of Egypt. So we'll be going to Ethiopia in November of this year, and there's details on that on our website.
Why did you choose Ethiopia? We've got 30 seconds.
Well, Ethiopia is the birthplace of humanity. That's where they found the oldest bones of human beings. Ethiopia is the birthplace of Christianity. It really is. And so I want to go to the places where we were born. I want to go to see the things that our ancestors did and then share that with those who are willing to listen. That's my responsibility as a memory recovery specialist.
This video has really enlightened me on many aspects in Black history, especially Africa. It has really enlightened me, and I love what our father, our uncle, Mr. Rock Newman is doing on his channel. He is bringing a whole lot of educational or resource persons that are enlightened about our history on his platforms to teach or to liberate the mindset of many Black people. The era we find ourselves right now is an era of liberation. We have been whitewashed. Our history has been whitewashed to think that we never had history. Our religion, our culture, our everything about Blacks has been whitewashed. We are now fighting to worship white Jesus or white God. We need to understand what religion our ancestors were worshiping. We need to understand whom we were. Many people make an argument that the white man didn't bring us Christianity, but Christianity was already in Africa. But if it was already in Africa, the Jesus whom they talk about, was he white? Because Africa, we are not white. Was he white? The names we see in the Bible are not African names. We see Samuel, we see, what do we call it? Daniel. We see, it's not African names. So how come you want to tell me the institution, the Christian institution I find myself in is an African? Yeah, they may be African, but was the story in the Bible accurate? Were the names in the Bible accurate? We need to understand, we need more facts about these things. So I love how Mr. Anthony Browder, I don't know, I hope I'm mentioning his name well. I hope whatever he's teaching is accurate. And I believe him. And I want to go deep into this history. I want to learn more about Black history, because how we find ourselves is not what we used to be. At the moment, we are just being lied to. People are just lying about Africa and African history. I wish I'll find a whole lot of videos about Black history for us to learn. Please, if you want to join my Telegram group, go to the description box, click on the Telegram link. It will take you to the platform. Join us for us to talk about the history and the well-being of Africans and Africans in diaspora. If today is also your first time coming to this channel, then don't forget to subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification button so that anytime I upload any great content, you will be notified. Thanks for watching.